The European Union has warned it would hit Chinese electric cars with import taxes as high as 38% from next month, unless the issue can be resolved through dialogue. Now, these taxes will be applied on top of the existing 10% tariffs on all Chinese EVs. Brussels has formally notified car makers, including BYD, Geely and SAIC, of the levies, due to be implemented around July the 4th. Now, each car maker will be taxed differently, depending on the extent to which they complied with the EU investigations. Now, major exporters, including BYD and Geely, will be hit by additional individual tariffs of between 17 and 20%. The move follows an investigation of subsidies that EU launched last year. Brussels says its probe revealed that the EV supply chain was heavily subsidized in China and that imports of Chinese EVs threaten European car manufacturers. China has signaled it is ready to retaliate and condemn the bloc's protectionist move. It also warned that the additional EU tariffs would harm Europe's own interests. The higher tariffs will be a significant blow to Chinese EV makers. The EU is the biggest market for Chinese EVs, accounting for nearly 40% of total exports from the country. There is also dissent within the EU, with Germany, a major trade partner to China, saying the tariffs would harm German companies. So while the probe targeted Chinese automakers, the higher rates will also hit a range of Western car makers. Tesla, which ships the Model 3 from Shanghai to Europe, as well as BMW and Renault. Now, the current charge on passenger car imports from Europe to China is 15%. Chinese electric vehicle makers' shares mostly dropped ahead of the EU's official announcement. Whole range of feedback for that. Let's go first to Olivia Siong. She's joining us live from Beijing. Ollie, now, the EU is, as we mentioned, a key market for Chinese EV makers. What's been the Chinese reaction to that move so far?
Jill, I've reached out to several Chinese car makers, EV makers, to get their response on this latest development. We have heard back from NIO in the statement that they sent to me over here. Now, they are facing a 21% tariff. And in that statement, it said that it strongly opposes the use of increased tariffs as a strategy to obstruct the normal global trade of electric vehicles, adding that its commitment in Europe is unwavering and that it remains hopeful that a solution can be found. Now, in some ways, car makers have seen this coming, given that the EU investigations have been ongoing for several months. But what we are finding out today is the amount of tariffs that these car makers are going to be slapped with. And I spoke with the chief economist of Hang Seng Bank China just a short while ago, and she told me that the tariff amount, which goes up to 38%, is big, given that what had been anticipated was a 25% duty. But this is still lower than what the US is intending to do, to quadruple its tariffs on Chinese EVs up to 100% this year. She said that it may not be as huge of a blow to Chinese car makers, and we have to note that each brand faces different and varying degrees of tariffs. For example, BYD faces a lowest 17.4% tariff. The expert told me that Chinese car makers have generally been able to manage their cost. And for example, BYD has a higher profit margin in Europe. And so even though this is a blow, it may not be a huge deterrence to them and their plans for the European market. But we have to note that these tariffs also hit foreign makers that are manufacturing here in China, for example, Tesla. And that expert told me that they may be more hard hit with this latest development as well. And it also could make those investors who are looking into putting more money into manufacturing of EVs here in China, they may be reconsidering their decisions and instead thinking about moving their investments to Europe instead. Jill.
Now, each manufacturer will have its own strategies, but big picture, what are the implications on broader China-EU trade relations, and what kind of retaliation might we expect from Beijing, who said it's quite prepared to do so?
Jill, this is certainly going to put added strain on China-EU relations. We heard a short while ago from China's foreign ministry saying that it will take necessary measures to firmly safeguard China's legitimate rights and interests. Now, it's not provided any details directly on what it intends to do, but we have seen hints, including in state media, that China could be looking at retaliatory measures in the agriculture or even aviation sectors, as the European Union is also investigating. We have to remember other Chinese sectors as well. And it comes as China has repeatedly called on the EU to have its own independent policy towards China and not to follow the US, which it says is taking actions to contain its development. Don't forget as well that Germany had warned of a possible impact to its own car manufacturers within China. We do know that the Chinese auto market and the EV market is the largest in the world. And so how China responds and what that means for foreign brands here in China is something to watch. But we also do have to remember that EVs have been dubbed one of the 3 new productive forces for China as it looks to give its economy a boost as it faces challenges, particularly from the property sector as well as a weak domestic demand. And so these latest tariffs following the US tariffs on Chinese EVs, certainly a blow, and it's something that the officials and car brands will have to take measures to address if it wants to achieve those economic targets that it set out. Jill.
Indeed. Ollie, thank you. Olivia Siong reporting 2 sides to every coin. Let's go now to Alex Cadier in Brussels for details on those tariffs. Alex, we're looking at the top end of the range, higher than the 35% estimated. Will the new tariffs boost sales for European EV makers on their home turf?
Well, according to senior European Commission officials I've been speaking to in the last few minutes, the answer to that is no. In fact, the objective, according to the European Commission, is to level the playing field, to offset what they see as unfair competition through state subsidies of Chinese EV companies importing cars into the European market. And one of the pieces of evidence that you can point to when it comes to that is actually European companies producing cars in China will be hit by higher tariffs than some Chinese companies. For example, BYD at 17%, lower than other European car makers who have joint ventures in China who will be hit by 21% tariffs. European Commission officials saying that they want to offset what they've described as a network of favorable conditions for Chinese EV producers in the Chinese market, including grants and green bonds and preferable financing rules, as well as tax exemptions across the board. And in the context of that, the European Commission says they're very eager to work with the Chinese government. They described the involvement of the Chinese government as being very active, but being very hesitant when it came to handing over information. The other thing to say is that these do kick in the next couple of weeks, but not in a permanent way. At that stage, it will just be required for the EV makers to put a guarantee forward that would be equivalent to the percentage they have to pay. The full enforcement, if European member states are on board, will happen later in the year.
So what you're saying is that it's going to be implemented in a phased approach. What happens when these measures come into full force? And what tools does the EU have if China decides to retaliate, bearing in mind that they've hinted that retaliation could go wider than the EV sector?
Yeah, well, this is one thing I asked of senior European Commission officials who were talking about this behind the scenes, and they said, look, we're not there yet. What we want is to work with the Chinese government to find a way to not have to implement these new tariffs. That is what's being said. But the question I put to them was, what if that network of Chinese state support for their EV producers just offsets these tariffs and ramps up that support so that Chinese car makers can keep the production high and the prices low? And they said, well, we could in future potentially open another investigation if market conditions would change significantly. So that will be one of the questions. They were asked about whether or not retaliation outside of car makers, particularly when it comes to French cognac or dairy products from across the European Union. They weren't drawn on that, and they had no comment to make, particularly on that. It's clear that there is a desire to avoid a trade war, but certainly it'll be a long few months until these tariffs kick in permanently in November.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you so much, Alex Cadier, reporting live to us from Brussels.